welcome to a discussion on the Camden Public Schools with Superintendent Rouhanifard. My name is Tia Morrison. I'm the Executive Director for Family and Community Engagement for the district, and we're here to ask the superintendent a handful of questions about recent announcements that have come across the district. So let's get started. You made several announcements last week. What were they?
So on Wednesday of last week, we released our budget for the upcoming fiscal year. We also released some additional details about the Renaissance schools, which are still pending state approval, but the schools that we've been discussing with the community for the past several months now. And we also began to take some actions to improve the special education services throughout the district.
So let's talk budget first. Talk us through the process. What did you discover when you began, and how did that discovery influence the process of building a budget for next school year?
Let me first say that going through a budget process is one of the most challenging tasks to take on as a superintendent as far as a conversation with the community goes, because a lot of times you have to share very difficult decisions. And so that is certainly what came to pass over the past couple of weeks here as we've been having the conversation throughout the city. What we discovered after a lot of work and a lot of analysis was that we inherited a really significant revenue shortfall. And so, we certainly don't want to point the finger, but past inaction has led us to inherit roughly a $60 million revenue shortfall because we basically spent more than the revenues that we had. Now, on top of that, we're certainly making some additional investments, roughly $16, $17 million of additional investments because of our strategic plan and our priorities, such as school security and Renaissance schools. But most of the revenue shortfall has to do with having spent more than revenues that we had in past years.
Layoffs are expected for central office and school-based employees. Yeah. There's a lot of misinformation out there. Can you give viewers a sense of who could be impacted and when they'll know a little bit more concretely the plans for next year?
So right now we don't have any finalized numbers. What we shared was that roughly 400 individuals would be impacted. Again, let me be clear, these are incredibly difficult decisions, and we did everything possible to avoid a reduction in our personnel to the extent we could. So we actually first instituted a spending freeze this year. We then looked at cutting non-personnel, and we found $30 million of savings in non-personnel. But what was left was, in order to balance our budget, we did have to reduce personnel. So as far as what people can expect, because I know that these are tough times and there's a lot of anxiety out there, but we will notify individuals by May 15th. No specific decisions have been made yet, as we're still working through, but again, we do anticipate roughly 400 people would be impacted, and of that, roughly 100 of those are central office administrators and roughly 300 are school-based staff.
So you also mentioned that this budget will include a number of investments and reallocations, many tied to the Camden Commitment. Can you talk a little bit about those for our viewers?
Yeah, so the Camden Commitment, I think a lot of folks know, is our strategic plan. There are 5 critical promises in there. First, improving school safety. Second, improving the state of our facilities. Third, improving teaching and learning and basic instructional practices. Fourth, ensuring that we're a parent-friendly school district and working to serve all of our families. And then fifth, having a more efficient central office. So to actually implement that plan, which was developed alongside our community, there are some costs associated. So, whether it's bringing in technology for improving school security and creating 21st century classrooms, or actually investing in our Renaissance schools, that in total gets us to about a $16 million investment.
Okay, so before we move on, let's talk a little bit about what you learned during this budget process so that folks watching at home might understand a little bit better, and what might they find surprising, particularly interesting?
It's a good question, because there's a lot of, as you mentioned earlier, misinformation. There's certainly a lot of anxiety and some fears. And I think that one thing we hear a lot is that you're reducing the number of teachers, which is one potential outcome here, and we shared that during the budget hearing. So who's going to serve our students? Well, the reality is, because we spent more than revenues that we had, we spent a lot of that money on personnel, and we are actually dramatically overstaffed. Now, that's not any one person's fault, and we're not here to point the finger again. But another way to think about that is we don't necessarily need that many staff to serve our students. for the instructional integrity in the classroom, we don't need to be staffed in the way that we are, and we certainly can't sustain that from a budget perspective. So one of the things that we learned is that we have one employee in the district for every 4 students. And that's one of the lowest ratios in the country to have that many staff members. So we do believe there's a path forward here. We certainly believe we have enough resources. We just have to right-size our budget in order to get there.
Let's switch gears now a little bit. On Friday, you made a few specific announcements that touched on 2 new schools and touched on all district schools in general. Let's talk new schools first.
So we approved locally here 2 new Renaissance School partners. These are nonprofit partners. One is Mastery and one is Uncommon Schools. Both of those schools are, again, Renaissance Schools, which is a byproduct of the Urban Hope Act, and they will be developing new construction. This is all pending state approval. For the Mastery School, it will ultimately develop new land, or develop a new building in the Kramer Hill community. And for Uncommon, they're searching for land within the Whitman Park or Liberty Park community. Until those buildings are ready, we want to temporarily locate them. Again, this is all pending state approval. So we announced that Uncommon will search for a building near the Whitman Park community, and again, just to be temporarily located. And Mastery has 2 different sites. One would be potentially in the East Camden community, and the second would be in the Pine Point School, which would be a co-location.
Let's talk a little bit more about these proposed changes for Pine Point Middle School next year.
So we were with the Pine Point staff last week, and we shared 2 pieces of news with them, which is the same news that we are now sharing publicly. So the first is about the co-location of Mastery Charter School, and that has everything to do with the available space in the building. So Pine Point is arguably the most underutilized building in the city of Camden. The capacity of the building is roughly 800 students, and Pine Point Middle School is less than 300 students right now. So there's a lot of available space that we can use more efficiently. The second piece of news, which is separate and apart from the co-location, is the decision to not send any new students to Pine Point. And that is very much driven by the improvement in special education services we'd like to provide. You know, Pine Point right now has a very heavy concentration of students with disabilities and English language learners, and that's just not sustainable. So the decision we've come to, it's a very difficult decision for us, but we believe one that is in the best interest of students, and that's to work with the current students at Pine Point and get them to the finish line and give them additional resources. And we've also announced that we're going to put a transition support team in place from the central office to make sure those students have the resources they need. But we're not going to send any new students to Pine Point, and we do believe that there's a systemic shortcoming there. And Pine Point has the lowest proficiency rate in the entire school district. So we don't believe it makes sense to send any more students to Pine Point, but again, we're not closing the school and sending those students elsewhere. We're going to work with those existing students and make sure they get to the finish line. But I want to stress one more time that that decision to not send new students to Pine Point is separate and apart, mutually exclusive from the decision to put Mastery Charter School in the building.
So let's talk a little bit about Renaissance schools, because you've mentioned them several times, and some people think that they are a quote-unquote drain on the district, but it's very interesting because you've discussed them several times as an investment. Can you say a little bit more about that? How are Renaissance schools an investment for our district?
It's an important question. I certainly acknowledge that there is a healthy disagreement on that. And look, at the end of the day, for us, we are working really hard to improve our existing district schools. But that shouldn't preclude us from opening up new options for our students and families that we know will provide immediately a great quality education for students and families. And so that's exactly what Renaissance schools allow us to do. You bring in proven educators, and these are nonprofits, which I think is another myth that's out there, that these are groups coming in to profit and taking our resources. They're nonprofits. And the idea is that they're going to be able, again, through their very talented teams, provide high-quality schools for our students and families. And in my point of view, that is an investment because they have a track record, and we know that as soon as they open their doors, we're going to get a great outcome for our students and families.
Can you talk a little bit more broadly about the changes that need to happen with special education in general in the district?
So we are going to institute a special education task force to, in part, implement recommendations from an audit. So we conducted a special education audit, which we shared with the community about a month ago. And a lot of those recommendations have to do with ensuring that our students with disabilities have access to a general education environment. So that task force We'll take that audit and some of the findings like the one I just shared with you and make sure that our district is implementing them. And we're excited to put together that task force made up in part with district staff and potentially some community members as well to help us think through what are the critical changes that we need to make.
Great. So before we sign off, can you share with us something that you're looking forward to during the rest of the school year?
Just making sure we're getting back into schools and spending time with our educators and with our students. I was just in Yorkshire yesterday, just doing an unannounced school visit, meeting with our teachers and seeing our students in the building. I'm going to be at Creative Arts next week. There are a couple community events that I think are worthwhile to note. There's going to be a Camden Night Gardens on April 17th, and I believe that this is going to be just a terrific opportunity for us to get together as a community. So just making sure we're spending as much time out in Camden Public Schools as we can.
Superintendent, thank you so much for this rich conversation.
Absolutely.
We're really looking forward to having many more of these discussions for our viewers at home so they can learn more about what's happening in the district. And viewers, if you have any additional questions about this broadcast or about anything that the superintendent discussed today, please email communications@camden.k12.nj.us. Thank you.